Most people watch Adventure Time once and think they understand it. Then they watch it again and they realize the show has been hiding things from them the entire time. A ruined building in the background appears across multiple seasons. A throwaway joke quietly turns into a tragedy years later. A symbol that seems meaningless keeps appearing whenever the same idea returns. Entire pieces of history are sitting in plain sight, visible from the very beginning, but almost nobody notices them because the show never asks you to look. That's what tonight is about. Not a single theory, not one character's story. We're going to walk through the details that Adventure Time buried in its backgrounds, its props, its colors, and its quietest moments. The details that make Ooo feel less like a cartoon setting and more like a real place with a past stretching far beyond the first episode. Some of these clues are confirmed directly by the show. Others are patterns that only appear after years of rewatching. But together, they reveal something strange. Adventure Time behaves as though the world continues existing even when the camera is pointed somewhere else. So, get comfortable. None of this needs your full attention. Let your eyes close whenever they want to. The clues have been waiting in these episodes for years already. They can wait a little longer for us. Not the biggest secrets, not the loudest twists, not the mythology that gets explained in dramatic speeches near the end of the series. We're exploring the quieter architecture of the world, the things that become visible only when you stop treating an episode as something rushing towards an ending and start treating it as a place you can simply spend time inside. There's a reason people keep returning to this show years after it ended. Part of it is the characters, part of it is the music, part of it is nostalgia, the particular feeling of revisiting a place that somehow seems larger than it did when you first saw it. But another part, I think, is that the show was built with an unusual amount of trust in the audience. It trusted that someone, someday, would pause the frame. It trusted that someone would remember a throwaway line from 3 seasons earlier. It trusted that a background object might matter to someone, even if it never became important to the plot. And because of that trust, the world became denser. The more slowly you watch it, the more it begins to resemble a real place, one with history layered under history, where objects stay worn in the same places, where buildings keep the same floor plan, where people own things long enough for those things to become part of who they are. Tonight is less about solving mysteries than about noticing that those layers were always there. So we're going to move gently. We'll start with things almost everyone has seen 100 times without really seeing them. Then we'll wander outward into background details, recurring visual motifs, small pieces of continuity, and quiet patterns that stretch across years of storytelling. Nothing here requires memorization. There's no test waiting at the end. Think of it more like walking through a familiar neighborhood late at night when everything looks slightly different, simply because you're finally looking at it slowly enough. And with that, let's begin where every episode begins, because the opening title sequence is the one part of the show almost every viewer has experienced repeatedly, and it's also the thing almost nobody actually looks closely because 30 seconds isn't very long, and most of us use that 30 seconds to grab a drink or settle into the couch rather than studying the screen. If you do pause it and look, the wreckage scattered through the landscape includes shapes that read as rusted vehicles and old military hardware, half buried in grass that's grown up around them the way grass grows around anything left undisturbed long enough. That's not incidental scenery. It's the show quietly telling you in the very first images of every single episode that this bright candy-colored world is standing directly on top of the wreckage of something else. Something considerably darker, long before any episode ever explains what that wreckage actually was. What's especially striking is how calmly the sequence presents that information. The camera glides over the landscape without lingering dramatically on any ruined object. There's no ominous music cue, no narrator explaining that civilization has already fallen, no character reacting with horror. The ruins are treated as ordinary. They're simply part of the environment, as natural to Ooo as trees or hills or clouds. That choice does something subtle to the viewer, because it asks you to accept the aftermath of a catastrophe as a normal part of everyday life before you even know there was a catastrophe to begin with. If you watch the sequence carefully across multiple episodes, the landscape starts to feel less like a fantasy kingdom and more like a place built on geological layers of forgotten history. The bright grass is only the newest layer. Underneath it are fragments of machines, collapsed structures, and hints of a civilization that once organized the world according to entirely different rules. The show doesn't need to explain it immediately because it has already planted the feeling of it. Long before the words Mushroom War become emotionally meaningful, the title sequence has been quietly teaching you that Ooo is an archaeological site disguised as a cartoon. That's a remarkably efficient piece of storytelling. Most fantasy worlds introduce themselves through maps, exposition, or dialogue. Adventure Time introduces itself through debris. The opening sequence also changes subtly over the course of the series, and those changes are worth paying attention to. As the world expands, as more kingdoms and characters become central to the story, the title imagery evolves alongside them, almost as though the sequence itself is growing older with the show. The changes are never presented as dramatic updates. They're cumulative. The same way a familiar neighborhood gradually acquires a new building, a different tree, a weathered sign, and one day you realize it no longer looks exactly the way it did years ago, even though no single change seemed important when it happened. The music contributes to this feeling as well. The theme is cheerful, adventurous, almost childlike, but it's carrying images of a world that has already survived something enormous. That contrast becomes one of the defining emotional textures of the entire series. The show rarely separates wonder from loss. Instead, it places them directly on top of each other, letting beautiful things grow out of broken ones, letting laughter happen in landscapes that remember violence, and letting a simple title sequence quietly contain both feelings at once. Once you notice that, it becomes difficult to unsee. Every rewatch begins differently. The opening is no longer just an introduction. It's a reminder that the show has been honest with you from the very beginning, and that many of its biggest revelations were never hidden at all. They were simply waiting for a slower kind of attention. Finn's backpack is worth its own moments of attention, because across the show's full run, an enormous number of items get pulled out of it, far more than could plausibly fit inside a bag that size if anyone involved had been strict about the physics. The writers never really worried about that. It became, through sheer repetition, something closer to a bag with its own internal logic, holding whatever a given episode happened to need it to hold. And a few episodes even lean into the joke directly, having other characters comment on how much Finn always seems to be able to produce from it. The backpack is interesting because it occupies a strange space between comedy and continuity. On one level, it's an old cartoon tradition, the impossible inventory, that allows an adventure story to keep moving without stopping every few minutes to explain where a rope, or a tool, or a strange magical object came from. But Adventure Time is unusually good at letting even that kind of cartoon convenience become part of a character's identity. Finn is a traveler, a collector, someone who rarely leaves home without the possibility of needing something unexpected. The backpack gradually starts to feel less like a joke and more like a portable history of his adventures. If you pay attention across multiple seasons, certain objects recur. Weapons he no longer actively uses don't necessarily disappear from existence. They get stored, carried, remembered. The bag becomes a kind of moving archive, a place where earlier episodes remain physically present, even after the story has moved on to new quests and new problems. That's a small thing, but it's consistent with the larger pattern we're going to keep encountering tonight. This show has an unusual reluctance to throw its past away. Even the way Finn wears the backpack stays remarkably consistent. The strap sits at the same angle, the bag rests in the same general position on his back, and the animators maintain that silhouette carefully across hundreds of episodes. It becomes part of his outline, almost as recognizable as the white bare-eared hat. If you saw only the silhouette of Finn with the backpack, you would know who it was immediately. That kind of visual consistency matters more than it seems because it allows the backpack to function almost like an extension of the character rather than a removable accessory. There's also something quietly touching about the fact that the bag is often present even in scenes where it serves no practical purpose. It's simply with him. Like a favorite jacket or a notebook someone has carried for years, it becomes part of the way he moves through the world. Adventure stories usually focus on the extraordinary moments, But objects become meaningful through ordinary repetition, and Finn's backpack is one of the show's clearest examples of an ordinary object slowly accumulating emotional weight through sheer constancy. The candy corn guards posted outside the Candy Kingdom's castle are drawn consistently to echo classic toy soldier design: stiff posture, blank expression, a kind of deliberate rigidity that reads as a specific visual reference once you notice it. It's a small joke, easy to miss, but it fits the show's broader habit of taking something ordinary and reskinning it in candy without ever pointing directly at what it's referencing. What makes the joke work is how completely the show is committed to it. The guards aren't simply candy-colored soldiers. They move with the same ceremonial stiffness associated with traditional palace guards and toy soldier imagery. Their posture, their symmetry, even the way they occupy space around the castle entrance reinforces the reference. The show doesn't stop to explain that they're based on toy soldiers because it doesn't need to. It trusts the visual language to do the work on its own. This is one of the quiet pleasures of the Candy Kingdom in general. Nearly everything there is simultaneously itself and a reference to something else. Buildings are desserts and also castles. Citizens are confectionery and also bureaucrats, scientists, artists, or guards. The kingdom operates according to fairy tale logic layered over candy store logic, layered over surprisingly recognizable political and social structures. The candy corn guards are funny because they reveal how much of the kingdom is built through this process of translation, taking familiar human institutions and rebuilding them out of sweets. And once you start looking for that process, you begin seeing it everywhere, not just in character designs, but in architecture, clothing, tools, and even background decorations. The Candy Kingdom is less a random collection of candy-themed jokes than a remarkably consistent visual system, one that keeps finding new ways to turn the ordinary world into something edible, without losing the underlying structure that makes the original recognizable. Jake's parents, Joshua and Margaret, appear as ghosts across a handful of episodes scattered over multiple non-consecutive seasons, and the show is careful enough about their appearances that attentive viewers were able to piece together a surprising amount of Jake's family history well before any single dedicated episode explained it fully. Small references, individually easy to forget, add up considerably once you actually lay them out side by side. That's one of the recurring patterns we're going to keep returning to tonight. Information arrives in fragments. The show often seems less interested in revealing a backstory all at once than in letting it slowly crystallize out of scattered observations, the way you gradually learn about a real person through years of small conversations rather than a single comprehensive explanation. Joshua and Margaret are a perfect example of that philosophy. They exist at first almost as emotional weather, a sense that Jake came from somewhere and someone, that his relaxed confidence and odd wisdom have roots extending beyond the episodes currently being told. The ghost appearances are brief, but they're consistent enough that they begin creating continuity pressure. You remember them. You notice that they're treated with a particular kind of affection, and when later episodes finally devote more time to Jake's family, the revelations don't feel like new information appearing from nowhere. They feel like pieces sliding into places that have quietly existed for a very long time. That sensation of a world that already contains answers before it decides to reveal them is one of the reasons Adventure Time rewards rewatching so deeply, and it begins much earlier than many viewers remember. The Nightosphere, Hunson Abadir's demon dimension, uses a consistent reddish-orange color palette distinct from anywhere else in the show. Every major kingdom in Ooo tends to have its own dominant color language if you start paying attention. Pink for the Candy Kingdom, blue for the Ice Kingdom. But the Nightosphere's palette reads as deliberately harsher, less pastel, more aggressive than anywhere else Finn and Jake ever visit. It's a quiet visual signal, present before a single line of dialogue confirms you're somewhere fundamentally different. The Nightosphere, Hunson Abadir's demon dimension, uses a consistent reddish-orange color palette distinct from anywhere else in the show. Every major kingdom in Ooo tends to have its own dominant color language if you start paying attention. Pink for the Candy Kingdom, blue for the Ice Kingdom. But the Nightosphere's palette reads as deliberately harsher, less pastel, more aggressive than anywhere else Finn and Jake ever visit. It's a quiet visual signal, present before a single line of dialogue confirms you're somewhere fundamentally different. What's interesting is that the Nightosphere doesn't simply use the color red, it uses a very particular family of reds and oranges, colors that suggest heat, ash, rust, and something ancient burning for a very long time. The backgrounds often feel less illuminated than glowing from within, as though the environment itself is emitting light rather than reflecting it. That distinction gives the place a strangely self-contained feeling, almost like a dream that generates its own atmosphere instead of borrowing one from the outside world. The show also tends to simplify the Nightosphere's visual language in subtle ways. Shapes become more severe, silhouettes become more pronounced, and the environments feel less cluttered with the kind of whimsical background details that fill much of Ooo. There's a sense of emptiness there that isn't necessarily literal emptiness. Demons and strange structures are everywhere, but emotional emptiness, a feeling that this is a place where ordinary comfort has been stripped away. Hunson himself fits perfectly into that palette. His suit remains dark and formal, but the colors surrounding him constantly reinforce the idea that he belongs to an entirely different order of existence than the characters who normally inhabit the grasslands or the Candy Kingdom. The visual design is doing quiet narrative work, telling you that Marceline's relationship with her father is not simply a family conflict. It's a relationship stretched across dimensions that obey different emotional and physical rules. Once you notice how consistently the show uses color to separate kingdoms from one another, the entire world becomes easier to read. You can often identify where a scene is taking place before the camera reveals any major landmark, simply from the dominant colors and the way light behaves in that environment. It's a remarkably disciplined piece of visual world building for a show that often appears, at first glance, to be gloriously chaotic. The Ice Kingdom's architecture consistently favors jagged, asymmetrical shapes, rather than the smoother, rounder ice formations a more conventional fantasy story might reach for. That jaggedness lines up, once you notice it, with the Ice King's own fractured mental state, holding consistently across every location associated with him compared to the more orderly geometry used elsewhere. It's worth spending a little time with those shapes, because they do more than simply make the kingdom look cold. The towers lean slightly, the walls feel irregular, windows are placed in waves that create imbalance rather than symmetry. Even when the castle is shown from a distance, it rarely presents a clean, stable silhouette. Instead, it looks as though it has grown by accident, accumulating frozen additions over years of improvisation rather than being carefully planned by a rational architect. That visual instability mirrors the Ice King himself almost perfectly. He is brilliant and broken, capable of moments of surprising clarity, followed by complete emotional disorganization. And his home reflects that same unstable structure. The castle feels inhabited by someone constantly rearranging reality according to whatever thought happened to occur a few minutes ago. Compare that with the Candy Kingdom, where buildings are often rounded, symmetrical, and carefully organized into readable civic spaces. Bubblegum's world values order, planning, and systems. The Ice Kingdom values impulse, obsession, and isolation. The architecture communicates that difference long before either ruler has a chance to speak. There's also a quieter detail hidden in the way snow and ice are animated there. The movement tends to be slower and more suspended than weather elsewhere in the show. Snowflakes drift with unusual patience, and frozen surfaces often remain almost perfectly still. That stillness contributes to the feeling that time behaves differently around the Ice King, as though his kingdom has been trapped in a prolonged emotional winter for longer than any ordinary season should last. Marceline mentions fairly early in the show that she used to live in the treehouse Finn and Jake now call home, and that detail gets referenced again, briefly, much later, tying her own history directly to the physical space where most of this show actually takes place. Easy to forget between the two mentions, spaced out by a considerable number of episodes, but it means the treehouse itself carries a quiet continuity most casual viewers never fully track. The implication is surprisingly large. The treehouse is not simply Finn and Jake's home. It is a location with a past that extends beyond them, inhabited by other people before they arrived, carrying emotional residue from lives that were already unfolding long before the series began. Marceline's connection to the treehouse quietly transforms it from a protagonist's headquarters into a historical location. That matters because the treehouse is where the audience spends so much of its time. It is the closest thing the series has to a permanent center. Adventures begin there, end there, and return there between journeys. Learning that Marceline once occupied that same space creates a subtle layering effect, where earlier and later versions of the world begin to overlap inside the same physical structure. If you revisit early episodes with that knowledge, ordinary shots of the treehouse start feeling slightly different. You begin imagining objects that may have been there before Finn and Jake, memories attached to rooms the protagonists now use casually, conversations that happened in the same spaces years earlier. The show never forces that feeling on you, it simply provides enough continuity for your imagination to do the rest. The treehouse itself changes over time, as we'll talk about later, but Marceline's history adds another kind of change, the invisible kind that comes from knowing a place has been lived in by more than one generation of characters. It's one of the reasons the location feels unusually real. Real homes usually have previous owners, previous stories, previous versions of themselves. This one does too. Peppermint Butler's design includes a small cross-shaped mark near the top of his head, consistent with an actual candy cane or mint, that some longtime viewers have also connected to his later revealed interest in considerably darker magical practices. Whether that detail was meant as an intentional early hint or simply followed naturally from designing a peppermint-shaped character is something the show never directly addresses, which makes it worth noticing regardless of the original intent behind it. What makes Peppermint Butler fascinating is how completely the show hides him in plain sight. He is introduced as background flavor, a polite, efficient servant whose main function seems to be making Princess Bubblegum's court feel more populated and functional. His voice is calm, his posture is impeccable, he appears exactly where a butler is supposed to appear. And then, very slowly, the edges of something much stranger begin to emerge. The occult references arrive in fragments, a suspiciously knowledgeable comment here, an unsettling expression there, a ritual implied rather than explained. The show never announces this character has been secretly involved in dark magic all along. Instead, it allows the audience to gradually realize that the perfectly mannered Candy Butler may be one of the most dangerous people in the entire kingdom. That realization works because the design has always been slightly uncanny. Peppermint Butler's face is simple, but not entirely innocent. His eyes are a little too calm. His smile is a little too composed. The cross-shaped detail near the top of his head becomes interesting precisely because it existed before viewers had any reason to treat it as potentially symbolic. Whether intentional foreshadowing or retrospective resonance, the effect is the same. A minor background character acquires hidden depth, and the kingdom around him becomes slightly stranger in retrospect. One of the pleasures of Adventure Time is that it repeatedly allows characters who seemed purely decorative to reveal entire private lives operating just outside the edge of the main story. The Cosmic Owl's appearances are spread unevenly across the show's run, sometimes absent for long stretches spanning multiple seasons before resurfacing, always inside a dream, always delivering something cryptic that later turns out to have predicted a specific real event. Fans who've tracked every appearance across the full run have found that gaps between them don't follow any obvious pattern, which keeps every new appearance feeling genuinely unpredictable. The Cosmic Owl is one of the show's most elegant pieces of myth-making because he operates according to rules that feel consistent without ever becoming completely understandable. Dreams in Adventure Time are already unusual spaces, places where memories, fears, alternate realities, and symbolic imagery frequently blur together. The Cosmic Owl introduces another layer, the possibility that some dreams are not merely psychological but cosmically significant. His design contributes enormously to that feeling. He is recognizable immediately even in a single frame, because the show treats him with a kind of visual stillness unusual for most of its characters. While many characters gesture, bounce, stretch, or move constantly, the Cosmic Owl often feels composed, deliberate, almost ceremonial.
He appears less like a participant in dreams and more like an observer who has entered them temporarily from somewhere else. The uneven spacing of his appearances is important. If he appeared every few episodes, viewers would start treating him as a recurring supporting character. Instead, he remains an event. Entire stretches of the series pass without him, which means the mythology surrounding him never has a chance to become routine. The show preserves his mystery simply by refusing to use him too often. There's also something quietly comforting about the fact that the dreams containing the cosmic owl are usually remembered. Characters wake up carrying the experience with them. The dream leaves a residue. In a show deeply interested in memory, destiny, and the strange ways different layers of reality interact, the cosmic owl becomes a kind of bridge between the personal and the cosmic, reminding the audience that even sleep might be connected to something unimaginably large. Gunter's design includes a specific eye shape, subtly different from how the show typically draws penguins in background crowd shots, present consistently from his very first appearance, long before anything about his true nature was ever explained. It's small enough that almost nobody consciously registered it during original broadcasts, but it's there, holding steady the entire time. This is one of those details that becomes almost impossible to appreciate fully until you already know the later reveal. Gunter spends so much of the early series functioning as comic relief, stealing objects, making strange noises, irritating the Ice King in ways that feel fundamentally harmless, that the audience has very little reason to scrutinize his design carefully. He is, after all, a penguin, or at least he appears to be. The eye shape is not dramatically different. It's the kind of variation that could easily be dismissed as normal animation inconsistency if it appeared only once or twice. What makes it remarkable is that it stays consistent across seasons, across directors, across different emotional contexts. Gunter keeps the same subtly unusual eyes. That consistency turns a tiny design decision into a piece of long-term storytelling infrastructure. The show is effectively placing a marker on the character years in advance, a visual reminder of an identity the audience does not yet know exists. Very few viewers would ever notice it during a first watch, but on a rewatch, it creates the uncanny sensation that the truth was always visible, quietly waiting in the background of ordinary scenes. That feeling, that revelation is often recognition rather than discovery, is one of the deepest pleasures of revisiting the series. The world rarely feels as though it is inventing itself retroactively. Instead, it feels as though it has been withholding context, allowing familiar images to become strange only after you learn how much they were carrying all along. Finn loses and regains various parts of his body across the show's run, starting with his arm and extending into other injuries in later seasons, and the show treats each loss with real consistency about how he adapts, learning new fighting styles, new habits, new ways of moving through a world that keeps taking pieces of him and asking him to keep going anyway. It's easy to remember the arm because it becomes such a major symbolic part of Finn's story, but what's more unusual is that the show keeps returning to the practical reality of adaptation. A different sword changes the way he stands. A prosthetic changes the way he reaches for things. Moments that could have been treated as one-time dramatic twists become ongoing parts of his everyday life. Most long-running animated shows avoid permanent physical consequences because they complicate production. Character models become harder to maintain, action scenes require new choreography, and continuity becomes more demanding. Adventure Time chooses the harder path surprisingly often. The injuries remain, the scars remain, the adjustments remain. That gives Finn's growth a physical dimension that many coming-of-age stories never quite achieve. He doesn't simply become wiser or more emotionally mature. His body records the passage of time. Adventures leave marks, battles leave limitations. Even magical solutions rarely restore him to an untouched original version of himself. There's also a quiet emotional honesty in the way the show portrays his frustration. Adaptation is rarely presented as effortless. He gets angry, he gets embarrassed, he struggles, and then, almost always, he continues. The story is less interested in triumph than in persistence, in the ordinary work of learning how to live differently after something irreversible has already happened. By the later seasons, Finn's changing body becomes one of the clearest visual indicators that this world allows time to matter. Characters remember, objects age, relationships evolve, and the hero is not protected from any of that. He is shaped by it, literally, in ways that remain visible long after the episode that caused them has ended. Flame Princess's color palette shifts subtly depending on her emotional state within a given scene, brighter and more saturated during anger, cooler and dimmer during calm. That's a quietly clever piece of character design, letting her own coloring do emotional work a line of dialogue would otherwise have to carry. If you watch her scenes closely, especially across the middle seasons when her emotional life becomes considerably more complicated, the changes are rarely exaggerated enough to feel like special effects. They're integrated into the animation itself. Her glow intensifies almost imperceptibly. The surrounding light warms slightly. The edges of her flames become sharper when she's upset and softer when she's reflective. What's impressive is that the show doesn't rely on a single visual cue. Saturation, brightness, and movement all work together. Anger is not just redder, it's more active. Calm is not just dimmer, it's more stable. The animation gives the impression that emotion is literally changing the physics of her body. That makes her one of the most visually expressive characters in the series even when she's not speaking very much. A quiet scene between Flame Princess and Finn can communicate enormous emotional information through color alone, which is part of why their relationship often feels unusually delicate. The audience is constantly reading her emotional temperature, sometimes before Finn is. It's also a subtle reminder that, unlike many fantasy characters whose elemental nature is mostly decorative, Flame Princess is genuinely made of fire. Her emotions are not merely represented by flame, they are inseparable from it. The design choice reinforces the idea that her struggle for emotional control is also a struggle for physical control, making her characterization feel unusually integrated with the world's magical rules. Susan Strong appears relatively early in the show's run, in an episode built around a mysterious, powerful figure Finn and Jake encounter, well before her actual backstory involving the human island community gets explained many seasons later. Viewers who remembered that early appearance were able to connect it directly to her eventual full reveal, a piece of long-term planning spanning an enormous number of episodes in between. Susan is one of the clearest examples of how Adventure Time introduces mysteries long before it seems interested in solving them. Her early appearances are intriguing, but they don't feel like the beginning of a major mythology arc. They feel like one more strange encounter in a world already full of strange encounters. That's precisely why the later reveal lands so effectively. The show allows Susan to exist as a question for years. Who is she? Why is she unusually strong? Why does she seem disconnected from the rest of Ooo in a way that feels different from ordinary eccentricity? The questions remain suspended in the background while dozens of unrelated adventures happen. When the human island storyline finally arrives, the earlier episodes suddenly acquire retrospective significance. Susan was never random. She was a fragment of a much larger story the audience simply didn't know existed yet. Rewatching those early episodes after learning her history creates the satisfying feeling that the answer had been quietly waiting all along. There's a broader storytelling lesson hidden there. The show often introduces people before it introduces the world they belong to. Instead of explaining a civilization and then populating it with characters, it gives you the character first and lets the civilization emerge later. That reversal makes the world feel discovered rather than designed, as though Finn and Jake are stumbling into pieces of history that were already happening independently of them. Princess Bubblegum's laboratory equipment recurs, drawn consistently across many episodes spread over multiple seasons. A specific piece of scientific apparatus glimpsed once early on reappears unchanged years later, suggesting the background art department was tracking a genuinely consistent internal sense of what her lab actually contained. This is one of those details that sounds almost absurdly minor until you think about what it implies behind the scenes. Television animation is a collaborative process involving many artists, many episodes, and long stretches of production time. Maintaining continuity for a recurring laboratory filled with dozens of props requires reference material, communication, and a decision that this level of consistency is worth the effort. Bubblegum's lab feels less like a generic science room and more like a real workspace because of that effort. Machines stay where they belong. Shelves contain recognizable, recurring objects. Certain experiments appear to continue existing even when they are not the focus of the episode. The effect is subtle but powerful. The audience begins to believe that Bubblegum actually works there between episodes, conducting research the camera never sees. The laboratory is not reset to a neutral state after every story. It accumulates projects, tools, and evidence of ongoing scientific activity. That accumulation reinforces one central character trait of Bubblegum's. She is always working. Even when the plot is focused somewhere else, the existence of a consistent laboratory suggests a ruler whose scientific life continues independently of whatever adventure Finn and Jake are currently having. The Fire Kingdom uses sharper, more angular architecture than anywhere else in Ooo, distinct even from the also somewhat jagged Ice Kingdom, which means every major kingdom in this world has developed its own consistent architectural language, specific enough that a single background frame could plausibly be identified purely by its shapes. The Fire Kingdom's buildings often resemble flames that have solidified into stone and metal. Towers taper into points. Bridges form sharp diagonals. Openings are cut into aggressive geometric patterns rather than rounded arches. The entire environment seems to be reaching upward and outward simultaneously. What's interesting is that these shapes communicate more than heat. They communicate tension. Where the Candy Kingdom feels organized and the Ice Kingdom feels unstable, the Fire Kingdom feels pressured. The architecture looks as though it exists under constant internal force, which fits a society built around volatile emotions, strict hierarchy, and the ever-present possibility of combustion. Even crowd scenes contribute to that feeling. Fire citizens tend to have more angular silhouettes than many of the rounded Candy characters, creating a subtle visual harmony between inhabitants and environment. The kingdom is not simply a place where fire-themed people live, it is a place whose entire design language has been shaped by the same elemental logic that shapes its citizens. This consistency across architecture, character design, and color palette is one of the reasons Ooo feels geographically coherent despite its extraordinary variety. Every kingdom is allowed to be visually extreme, but each one is extreme in a different, carefully controlled direction. The tree fort itself changes in small, cumulative ways across a 10-season run, gradually accumulating new additions and modifications that track roughly with the passage of in-show time. Compare an early season shot against a late season one directly, and you'll notice a home that's quietly evolved the whole time, the way an actual lived-in space accumulates change.
The changes are rarely dramatic enough to announce themselves. A new room appears, a platform is expanded. Furniture shifts, decorations accumulate. Objects that once seemed temporary become permanent parts of the environment. That gradual evolution is emotionally important because the tree fort is where the audience repeatedly returns between adventures. It functions almost like a visual heartbeat for the series. Seeing it change means seeing the characters change, even when no single episode is explicitly about growing older. Real homes tell stories through modifications. Shelves appear because someone needed storage. A window is repaired because it was damaged. A room changes purpose because the people living there have changed. The tree fort follows that same logic. It becomes less an iconic cartoon location and more a record of years spent living together. By the final seasons, the fort contains visible evidence of friendships, losses, experiments, and countless ordinary days that were never important enough to become episodes. That is a remarkably difficult illusion to create in animation, and Adventure Time sustains it with quiet confidence for the better part of a decade. Marceline's bass guitar, and its earlier form as her family's battle axe, share a consistent overall silhouette across flashback sequences, even as the specific details clearly get reworked. That consistency of shape, tracked across a transformation the show only fully explains much later, is a small, deliberate piece of visual continuity worth appreciating on its own terms. The silhouette is the important part. Even when the weapon becomes an instrument, the broad proportions remain recognizable.
The long handle, the weighted lower shape, the sense that this object was originally designed to be swung before it was ever designed to be played. The animators could easily have treated the bass as a completely new prop introduced for Marceline's musical identity, but instead they allow traces of the older object to remain visible inside the newer one. That decision gives the transformation emotional weight before the audience fully understands it. The bass always feels slightly unusual, slightly heavier than an ordinary instrument, slightly more like something that has survived a previous life. When later episodes reveal its history, the revelation feels visual as much as narrative. You are not simply learning new information, you are recognizing a shape you have been looking at for years. It also fits Marceline remarkably well as a character. She is someone who repeatedly turns remnants of violence into forms of expression. A weapon becomes music. Centuries of loneliness become songs. Traumatic memories become stories she can perform for other people. The bass is therefore not just a clever piece of continuity, it is a physical embodiment of one of the show's quietest recurring themes. That survival often involves transforming what hurt you into something that can still make beauty. There is another subtle detail hidden in the way she carries it. Marceline moves with the bass the way someone moves with an object that has become part of their body through years of familiarity. It rests naturally against her shoulder. She swings it with effortless confidence. Whether she is fighting, performing, or simply holding it during a conversation, the instrument never feels like a temporary accessory. It feels like an extension of her history. Episodes dealing with grief or loss tend to use noticeably muted, cooler color grading compared to the show's usual bright default palette, a technique common enough in animation generally, but applied here with enough consistency that longtime viewers often sense an emotionally heavy turn coming before any dialogue confirms it. What's striking is how restrained the technique is. The show rarely drains all the color from a scene or announces sadness through exaggerated visual effects. Instead, it nudges the palette gently away from warmth. Greens become slightly duller. Blues become slightly more present. Shadows deepen almost imperceptibly. The world remains recognizably the same place, but it feels as though a thin layer of emotional distance has settled over it. Because Adventure Time is normally so colorful, even a small reduction in saturation becomes noticeable. The audience may not consciously identify the color shift, but they feel it. The episode begins to breathe differently. Jokes linger a little longer before landing. Quiet moments occupy more screen time. The visual atmosphere prepares the emotional atmosphere. This is especially effective in episodes where the characters themselves are trying not to talk directly about what they're feeling. The color grading becomes a kind of second narrator, acknowledging grief even when the dialogue remains understated. A less confident show might rely on speeches to explain sadness. This one often trusts the audience to recognize sadness through light, shadow, and temperature. The technique also reinforces the idea that emotions affect environments. Ooo is not a world entirely separate from its inhabitants. The places seem to absorb the emotional weather of the people moving through them. A familiar forest can feel different depending on who is walking through it and what they are carrying internally. The muted palette turns ordinary locations into emotional landscapes without changing their physical structure at all. A specific musical motif tied to Marceline's more vulnerable moments recurs consistently enough across different seasons that attentive listeners picked up on the pattern long before any official confirmation that it was deliberate rather than simple reuse. The musical motif is never treated like a dramatic cinematic theme that announces itself loudly whenever Marceline enters the frame. It appears quietly, often underneath dialogue or during moments where she is remembering, hesitating, or allowing herself to be emotionally exposed. The melody is gentle enough that many viewers register it as familiarity rather than recognition.
That's part of what makes it powerful. Music in Adventure Time often functions the way memory functions. A melody returns not because the plot requires a callback, but because a character is emotionally returning to a place they have visited before. Marceline's recurring motif becomes a kind of emotional fingerprint, connecting scenes separated by years of broadcast time through a shared musical feeling. When you listen for it across multiple seasons, you begin noticing that the show is creating continuity not only through objects and dialogue, but through sound.
A single melodic phrase can quietly remind the audience of previous losses, previous reconciliations, previous versions of Marceline herself. The music is carrying history. This is one of the advantages of a series that integrates songs so deeply into character identity. Marceline is not merely a character who occasionally sings. She's a musician, which means recurring musical material feels natural rather than artificially cinematic. The show can reuse emotional motifs without drawing attention to the reuse, allowing the audience to experience continuity almost subconsciously. Betty's design shifts in small, cumulative ways across her scattered appearances, tracking a slow visual decline that mirrors her deepening instability well before the show states directly how far she's actually fallen. It only really lands if you go back and watch her appearances in sequence, rather than encountering them spread naturally across years of broadcast. The changes are subtle enough that they almost disappear during a first viewing. Her posture becomes slightly less composed. Her expressions linger in moments of distraction. The neatness of her appearance gradually gives way to something more obsessive, more exhausted, more consumed by a single impossible goal. Because Betty appears intermittently, the audience experiences these changes as jumps rather than a continuous progression. That makes the decline easy to underestimate. But watched back to back, the transformation is surprisingly heartbreaking. You can see a brilliant, compassionate person slowly reorganizing her entire identity around the hope of saving Simon. What makes this especially painful is that the show rarely frames Betty as simply going crazy. Instead, it presents her as becoming increasingly isolated inside a purpose that feels morally understandable. She's trying to help someone she loves. The tragedy is not that her motivation is evil. The tragedy is that her motivation gradually becomes the only thing left. The visual changes support that reading beautifully. She never becomes an entirely different character. The original Betty remains visible underneath the exhaustion and obsession, which is exactly what makes the later emotional payoffs feel earned. The audience has been watching the same person slowly disappear inside herself for years. The grass sword's slow transformation across the show's run is drawn with enough visual consistency that a careful viewer could reconstruct its entire timeline purely from screenshots without needing dialogue to explain what's actually happening to it at each stage. This is one of the clearest examples of the show treating a magical object as though it were a living thing with its own developmental history. The sword changes gradually. Textures shift, shapes evolve. The relationship between Finn and the weapon becomes increasingly complicated as the object reveals that it is not simply a tool, but something with its own internal logic. What's remarkable is that the visual evolution never feels arbitrary. Each stage looks like it could plausibly grow out of the previous one. The design language remains consistent even as the sword becomes stranger, allowing the audience to track its transformation intuitively. The sword also becomes a fascinating reflection of Finn himself. As he grows older and more psychologically complicated, his weapon becomes less straightforward. Earlier swords function largely as heroic equipment. The grass sword eventually functions almost like an externalization of unresolved internal forces, something that is simultaneously useful, dangerous, protective, and invasive. Because the transformation unfolds across such a long span of episodes, it acquires the texture of real change rather than episodic change. The audience has time to get used to each version before the next one arrives. The sword does not reinvent itself overnight. It matures, mutates, and accumulates consequences. Jake's stretching abilities follow a remarkably consistent internal logic about what does and doesn't work. Certain shapes reliably succeed, hammocks, umbrellas, simple tools, while others are consistently played for failure, suggesting an informal but genuinely held set of rules the writers maintained across the entire series. This is easy to overlook because Jake's powers are often presented comedically. He stretches into absurd forms, solves problems through improvisation, and frequently uses his body as a punchline. But beneath the comedy is a surprisingly disciplined sense of physical possibility. Jake is extraordinarily powerful, yet not infinitely powerful. Certain transformations require effort, certain sizes become difficult to maintain, certain complex structures tend to collapse or behave unpredictably. The show keeps enough limitations in place that his abilities remain interesting rather than becoming a universal solution to every problem. That consistency matters because it preserves tension. When Jake struggles to hold a shape, the audience believes the struggle. The rules may never be written down explicitly, but they are stable enough that violations would feel noticeable. There's also something revealing about the kinds of objects Jake most naturally becomes. They are often domestic, playful, or supportive. Beds, bridges, vehicles, umbrellas, protective structures. Even when he becomes a weapon, he frequently functions by helping someone else rather than dominating a scene himself. His powers reflect his personality. He is fundamentally someone who creates space for other people. Lumpy Space Princess's outline is drawn deliberately wobblier and less clean than most other major characters, reinforcing her thematic connection to looseness and resistance to fixed shape well before that connection gets explicitly explored in the show's later mythology. Her animation is almost always slightly unstable. The edges of her body feel less defined, less committed to a single exact form. She drifts, jiggles, and reshapes herself constantly in small ways that most viewers simply accept as part of her comedic design. But that visual instability turns out to be doing more than comedy alone. Lumpy space itself is associated with transformation, ambiguity, and resistance to rigid categories. Lumpy Space Princess therefore embodies her world not only through color and dialogue, but through the very quality of her outline. She looks like someone who is never entirely finished becoming herself. This gives her a surprisingly interesting presence in scenes with more visually stable characters. Standing next to Finn or Bubblegum, she introduces a different kind of movement into the frame, a reminder that not every part of Ooo obeys the same rules of form and identity. The design also contributes to her emotional unpredictability. Because her body is already visually unstable, sudden shifts in mood feel physically plausible. She can move from melodrama to vulnerability to absurdity without the transitions feeling forced. Her animation has been preparing for those emotional oscillations all along. A striking number of episodes close on a shot of the night sky over the tree fort, a quiet, recurring visual bookend the show returns to often enough that it functions as an unofficial signature closing image, never called out directly, simply present, letting the day's adventure settle into the quiet of an ordinary night. The repetition is important. A single sunset or nighttime shot would simply be a pretty ending. Dozens of them, scattered across seasons, become a rhythm. No matter how strange the episode has been, whether it involved cosmic beings, alternate dimensions, magical catastrophes, or deeply personal emotional revelations, the series often returns to the same simple image: the world at night, the tree fort still standing, the adventure temporarily complete. That recurring image does something profoundly comforting. It reminds the audience that Ooo continues after the episode ends. The sky remains, the fort remains. Tomorrow will arrive, bringing another adventure, another conversation, another ordinary day inside an extraordinary world. For a show so interested in impermanence, that repeated return to the night sky becomes a quiet gesture of continuity. The characters change, the kingdoms change, the audience grows older. But the stars above the tree fort keep appearing, patiently, episode after episode, offering the same gentle reassurance every time. The world is still here, and for tonight, that is enough. Let's slow down and spend some real time on a few of these in more depth, because a fact delivered once and moved past quickly doesn't always get to be appreciated for everything it's actually doing. Take the treehouse's slow accumulation of detail across 10 seasons. It's worth actually picturing what that means in practice. Every season, the animators had to keep drawing a location that had by that point already been established across dozens of prior episodes. And rather than treating it as a fixed, unchanging set, the way a lot of animated shows simplify their recurring locations purely for production efficiency, this show let it keep growing. New shelves, new decorations, small signs of a life still being actively lived inside it, rather than a location frozen at the moment it was first designed. That's a genuinely unusual level of care for a show working within a television budget and schedule, and it's part of why the tree fort feels less like a set and more like an actual home the longer you spend inside it. What makes that especially interesting is that the changes are rarely highlighted by the story itself. The show almost never pauses to announce that the treehouse has been renovated, expanded, or reorganized. It simply allows those changes to exist. A staircase may be slightly different. A corner may contain objects that weren't there before. A room may feel fuller than it did several seasons earlier. That restraint is important. Real homes change quietly. People add shelves because they need shelves. They move furniture because living in a place gradually reveals better ways to use it. They keep souvenirs because throwing everything away every few months would be exhausting. The tree fort follows that same logic. It behaves like a place that has been occupied continuously, not a television location that resets itself after every episode. There's also something emotionally grounding about returning to a space that remembers previous adventures. A sword mounted on a wall, a strange object left on a shelf, a piece of furniture added after an earlier story. These become visual reminders that the series has a past. The characters are not beginning from zero each week. They are carrying accumulated experience, and their home is carrying it with them. By the later seasons, the tree fort has become almost autobiographical. You can read years of friendship, experimentation, conflict, and ordinary domestic life from the objects surrounding Finn and Jake. The audience may not consciously inventory every item, but the density of history is felt even when it is not explicitly noticed. Or take the show's handling of color grading during emotionally heavy episodes. It's worth naming exactly what that technique is doing, structurally, because it's easy to notice without fully appreciating the craft behind it. Color grading shifts the entire emotional register of a scene before a single word gets spoken, priming an audience, consciously or not, for what's about to happen. A show that uses this technique consistently enough is, in effect, training its audience to feel the emotional shape of an episode through pure visual language, which matters enormously for a show that also, across many of its most significant episodes, relies on subtlety and restraint rather than loud, explicit emotional cues. The visual grammar is doing work the dialogue deliberately leaves unsaid. The more you pay attention to it, the more you realize that Adventure Time is unusually comfortable communicating through atmosphere. A quiet room, a cooler sky, a slightly desaturated forest, a familiar location that suddenly feels emotionally distant without changing physically at all. These are not merely aesthetic choices, they are narrative choices. One of the reasons the show's emotional episodes often linger in memory is that they rarely tell you exactly how to feel. Instead, they create conditions under which feeling becomes almost unavoidable. The audience is allowed to arrive at sadness rather than being pushed toward it. The muted colors, slower pacing, and gentler music form a kind of emotional invitation rather than a command. This is especially effective because the show spent so much of its runtime being playful. Brightness is a default. Energy is a default. Humor is a default. So when the visual language softens, the contrast itself carries meaning. The audience has unconsciously learned what the ordinary world of Ooo looks like, which means even a subtle deviation from that ordinary world becomes emotionally legible. There's something worth adding about Gunter's early, subtle design choice too, because it's one of the clearest examples in the whole show of information being technically available to the audience for years before anyone had the context to actually use it. That's a genuinely rare piece of long-game visual storytelling, not simply foreshadowing through dialogue, which is relatively common, but foreshadowing through a specific, consistent piece of character design that required years of hindsight to actually register as meaningful. Most viewers, watching week to week during original broadcast, had no way of knowing that detail mattered at all. It simply sat there, quietly true, waiting for the reveal that would eventually give it context. What I find fascinating about that is how different it feels from a twist. A twist usually replaces one understanding with another. Gunter's reveal does something subtler. It expands the meaning of scenes that were already familiar. Earlier episodes are not invalidated, they are deepened. The penguin remains funny, remains mischievous, remains strangely attached to the Ice King, but all of those qualities begin existing alongside an entirely different layer of identity. That is one of the show's most distinctive storytelling habits. Rather than erasing earlier interpretations, it tends to preserve them and add additional layers on top. Marceline is still funny after you learn her history. Simon is still ridiculous after you understand his tragedy. Bubblegum is still brilliant after you see her moral compromises. Gunter is still a troublesome little penguin after you know what else he has been all along. The result is that rewatching feels less like correcting misunderstandings and more like discovering hidden dimensions inside memories you already had. It's worth pausing, too, on the specific choice to let Finn's body keep changing across the show's run, rather than simply having him lose an arm once in one episode and then move on with the change treated as a settled, background fact from that point forward. The show returns to his adaptation repeatedly, letting different episodes explore different aspects of how he learns to compensate, fight, and function differently each time his body changes again. That's a level of ongoing attention to physical change that a lot of shows, even ones dealing seriously with disability or bodily difference, tend to treat as a single dramatic event rather than an ongoing, evolving process. This show keeps returning to it across multiple seasons, treating adaptation as something that keeps happening rather than something that simply gets resolved once and then forgotten. That distinction matters because real adaptation is rarely a single moment. Someone does not wake up one morning fully adjusted to a permanent change. They adjust repeatedly. New situations reveal new difficulties. Old habits return unexpectedly. Confidence arrives in one context and disappears in another. The show captures that ongoing quality surprisingly well. Finn's body becomes a timeline. You can almost map seasons through the state of his arm, his weapons, his posture, and the way he approaches physical challenges. Earlier episodes are filled with the confidence of someone who believes the world can be solved through straightforward courage. Later episodes are inhabited by someone who has learned that courage often has to coexist with limitation. There's also an interesting visual side effect. Because the audience sees Finn so frequently, even small physical changes become emotionally noticeable. A new arm is not just a new design. It is a reminder of everything that happened between the previous design and this one. The body carries narrative memory. A broader pattern worth naming across everything we've covered so far tonight is something that connects all of these small details together into a single underlying philosophy about how this particular show chooses to build its world. Nothing here was treated as disposable. Background locations kept their own internal consistency across years of episodes. Minor characters got real, considered design work even when they'd only ever appear once. Color and sound were used as carefully as dialogue, sometimes more carefully, to carry emotional and narrative weight the actual words never stated outright. Objects remembered previous stories. Houses remembered previous occupants. Characters remembered previous injuries. That consistency of care, applied this broadly across this many small, easily overlooked details, is really what built the specific, dense, lived-in feeling this world has. The feeling that's kept people coming back to it, rewatching it, building videos exactly like this one years after new episodes stopped being made at all. I think there's something quietly reassuring about that kind of craftsmanship. Not because every detail is perfect, it isn't, but because the show behaves as though small things are worth doing well even when almost nobody will notice them. A recurring prop, a consistent shadow, a melody returning after several seasons, a room that slowly fills with evidence of years spent living inside it.
Most viewers never consciously register any single one of those choices, but they register the accumulation. They register the feeling that Ooo continues existing after the episode ends, that characters have mornings we never see, conversations we never hear, objects they keep for reasons that have nothing to do with the current plot. The world feels inhabited because the show repeatedly spends energy on things that are not strictly necessary for storytelling efficiency. That may be the most unusual Easter egg of all.
Not a hidden symbol or a background joke or a piece of foreshadowing. A philosophy. The philosophy that attention itself is a form of care, and that if you build enough small, consistent truths into a fictional world, people will eventually begin to love that world the way they love places they have actually lived. And once that happens, every rewatch becomes less like consuming a story and more like returning somewhere familiar. Which is probably why we're still here tonight, wandering through details that were never important enough to become headlines, and discovering that they were quietly holding the whole atmosphere together all along. Let's keep going, because there's more worth sitting with before we let tonight rest. The Enchiridion, the hero's manual Finn carries throughout much of the show, is drawn with a consistent, weathered texture across every appearance, small scuffs and wear marks that stay fixed in the same places rather than being redrawn slightly differently each time it appears. That's the kind of continuity that only really matters if you're pausing screenshots and comparing them directly. But it's there, holding steady, book after book, episode after episode. The first thing that stands out once you start paying attention is that the Enchiridion never looks new. Even in relatively early appearances, before the audience has spent years with it, the book already carries visible history. The corners are softened. The cover looks handled rather than pristine. The pages have a thickness that suggests repeated use rather than ceremonial importance. It feels less like a legendary artifact locked behind glass, and more like a manual that has actually been carried by generations of people who expected to get dirt on it. That choice changes the emotional relationship between Finn and the book. A perfectly clean magical object often feels distant, something to be protected from the world. The Enchiridion feels like something meant to travel through the world. It belongs in backpacks, on forced floors, in the middle of dangerous quests where pages might get bent and covers might get scratched. The wear marks become evidence that heroism, in this universe, is practical before it is glamorous. There's another subtle effect created by that consistency. Because the same scratches remain in the same places across years of episodes, the audience begins treating the book as a single continuous object rather than a symbolic prop that gets redrawn whenever necessary. It develops identity. You recognize it the way you would recognize a friend's old notebook from the specific crease across the front or the torn edge near the spine. The continuity transforms familiarity into affection. It also fits neatly with the show's broader relationship to history. The Enchiridion is not simply important because of what is written inside it. It is important because it has existed for a long time, because other hands have held it, because it carries physical evidence of a past that extends beyond the current story. Adventure Time repeatedly suggests that objects become meaningful through duration, and the Enchiridion is one of the clearest examples of that idea made visible. BMO's screen displays a genuinely wide range of different expressions and interfaces across the show's run, far more variety than a simple robot character would strictly need, and several of those specific screen designs recur in later episodes in ways that reward viewers who remember the earlier appearance. BMO's face isn't simply a single design reused indefinitely. It's a whole small library of expressions, deployed with real consistency depending on what a given scene actually needs BMO to convey. What's remarkable is that BMO's emotional range is achieved with extremely limited visual elements. A few pixels shift, a mouth changes shape, simple lines rearrange themselves into delight, confusion, sadness, embarrassment, or quiet contemplation. The economy of the design makes the expressiveness even more impressive. BMO can feel astonishingly alive while technically remaining one of the simplest character models in the entire series. If you watch carefully across multiple seasons, certain interface screens reappear in surprisingly specific contexts. A particular game display returns later almost unchanged. A familiar loading animation shows up during a different story. The internal world of BMO feels persistent, as though the little console has software, memories, and habits that continue existing between episodes. That persistence is important because BMO is often treated by the other characters as simultaneously a person and the machine. The recurring interfaces quietly support both interpretations. They remind us that BMO has an internal technological life independent of the main cast, a private world of games, programs, songs, and tiny electronic routines that nobody else fully experiences. The screen becomes a window into a consciousness that is playful, lonely, imaginative, and surprisingly old. There's also something quietly touching about how often BMO's expressions are directed at objects rather than people. BMO reacts to sunsets, to toys, to memories, to imaginary conversations. The screen suggests an inner life that is constantly active, even when the plot is focused elsewhere. Like the tree fort, BMO seems to continue existing between episodes, thinking thoughts we never hear, and feeling emotions that do not always become stories. The Ice King's crown in its earliest appearances is drawn slightly differently from how it eventually settles later in the show's run, a small design evolution that happened gradually enough most viewers never consciously noticed the shift happening in real time, the same kind of slow, cumulative change we already discussed regarding the tree fort and the grasslands more broadly. The differences are not dramatic. The points become more defined. The jewel arrangement becomes slightly cleaner. The overall proportions stabilize. But because the changes happen gradually across years of production, they feel less like a redesign and more like an object coming into sharper focus. That gradual stabilization has an interesting unintended consequence. The crown begins to feel increasingly specific. Early on, it is primarily a symbol, the thing that makes the Ice King who he is. Later, it becomes a distinct artifact with recognizable physical characteristics, something that could plausibly be tracked across centuries of flashbacks and different owners. The design evolution accidentally mirrors the narrative evolution. As the show becomes more interested in Simon Petrikov, Betty, and the crown's deeper history, the crown itself becomes visually more concrete. It's also worth noticing how consistently the crown is treated as heavy. Characters do not wear it casually. It sits with weight. It changes posture. When removed, the absence is immediately noticeable. The animators repeatedly communicate that this is not merely a decorative royal accessory, but a burden, something physically and psychologically difficult to carry. That sense of weight becomes retrospectively heartbreaking once the audience understands what the crown actually costs. The object has been sitting on Simon's head for centuries, and the show has been quietly drawing it as something burdensome long before it fully explained why. Princess Bubblegum's actual age is never stated as a single specific number anywhere in the show, deliberately left vague even as the show gives you enough surrounding evidence. Her presence in flashbacks spanning centuries, her unchanging appearance across the entire present-day timeline, to understand that she's considerably older than she looks. That specific, deliberate vagueness is worth noticing as its own kind of choice, consistent with how carefully this show tends to handle exact numbers and firm timelines throughout its entire run. The vagueness does something surprisingly useful. It prevents Bubblegum from becoming a puzzle to solve and allows her to remain a mystery to live with. The audience understands the emotional truth that she has outlived enormous amounts of history without needing a precise chronological spreadsheet. That matters because longevity in Adventure Time is usually treated as an emotional condition rather than a numerical one. Marceline is old, Bubblegum is old, the Ice King is old. What the show is interested in is not exactly how many years have passed, but what it feels like to remember worlds that no longer exist. Bubblegum's age becomes visible through behavior more than through exposition. She has habits that feel centuries old. She plans on unusually long timescales. She carries herself with the confidence of someone who has solved many problems before. At the same time, she remains capable of pettiness, curiosity, insecurity, and joy. The show refuses to turn longevity into omniscience. That refusal is one of its smartest decisions. Characters who live for centuries are often written as detached from ordinary emotion. Bubblegum is not detached. She is simply burdened by memory. The ambiguity surrounding her exact age allows that emotional reality to remain more important than any specific number ever could. The show's use of practical, in-universe technology, old-world objects repurposed for entirely new Candy Kingdom or post-war purposes recurs constantly across background shots, rewarding viewers who like spotting a piece of pre-war human technology being used for something its original designers never could have anticipated. This is one of the easiest details to miss during a first watch, because the repurposing is usually treated as completely ordinary by the characters. A rusted vehicle becomes part of a building, a piece of industrial machinery becomes a decorative object, an abandoned structure becomes a home, a laboratory, or a kingdom. The show rarely pauses to identify these remnants as relics. Instead, it treats them the way people in a genuinely post-apocalyptic society might treat them, as available materials. The past is not a museum, it is infrastructure. Ooo has been built partly by inventing new meanings for old objects. That approach gives the world an unusual archaeological depth. Backgrounds are full of stories that are never told directly. A half-buried highway suggests a vanished transportation system. A rusted tank suggests a war that once involved organized militaries. A shattered skyscraper suggests cities, economies, and millions of ordinary lives that existed before Candy Kingdoms and talking rainbows. What makes this especially effective is that the characters themselves often do not know the original purpose of what they are using. The audience is occasionally in the strange position of recognizing human technology that has become mysterious inside its own future. We are the ones with archaeological knowledge, looking backward at our own civilization through the eyes of people who inherited only fragments of it. Finn's sword collection across the show's run is genuinely extensive, and several earlier swords, retired from active use once he acquires something new, still appear occasionally in background shots of the treehouse, mounted or stored rather than simply vanishing from continuity the moment a newer weapon takes over the spotlight. That continuity is surprisingly important because it prevents earlier adventures from being erased. Each sword represents a period of Finn's life, a set of battles, friendships, losses, and discoveries. By allowing those weapons to remain physically present, the show allows previous versions of Finn to remain present as well. The treehouse becomes a museum of growth. A sword that is no longer useful is not discarded, it is remembered. The walls gradually accumulate evidence of who Finn has been. The audience may not consciously identify every weapon, but the visual density communicates that many stories have already happened.
There's also a quiet maturity in the idea that newer does not automatically mean more meaningful. Some swords disappear because they are lost. Others remain because they mattered. The collection suggests that identity is built through accumulation rather than replacement. Finn does not become a completely different person every season. He becomes a person carrying many earlier selves simultaneously. That is one of the deepest emotional currents running underneath Adventure Time. Growth without erasure. The past is rarely deleted. It is stored, scarred, mounted on a wall, carried in a backpack, or remembered in a song. And the swords, hanging quietly in the background while entirely different stories unfold in the foreground, become one more reminder that Ooo is always larger than the episode currently being told. The specific cadence of Jake's speech patterns, his tendency toward loose, meandering sentences full of casual filler words, is maintained with real consistency across the entire voice performance, season after season, in a way that gives him one of the most immediately recognizable vocal rhythms in the whole cast, distinct even from characters occupying a similarly laid-back register. It's worth actually listening to Jake separately from the plot for a moment. He rarely speaks in perfectly efficient sentences. He circles ideas, he pauses. He starts one thought, wanders into another, and somehow still arrives exactly where he meant to go. His dialogue has the texture of someone thinking while talking, someone who trusts that conversation is not a test to be passed, but a place to spend time. That rhythm becomes one of the show's quietest forms of comfort. Even when Jake is discussing something serious, his voice carries a kind of spaciousness. There is room inside his sentences. They do not rush toward conclusions. They invite the other person to exist alongside them for a while. What's remarkable is that this consistency survives enormous changes in Jake's role across the series. Early on, he is often the comic partner, the more experienced adventurer, the older brother figure. Later, he becomes a husband, a father, a philosopher almost by accident, someone whose seemingly casual observations turn out to contain an enormous amount of hard-earned wisdom.
Through all of that, the cadence remains recognizably Jake. The voice performance is doing an extraordinary amount of characterization. A different rhythm would create a different person. If Jake spoke with Bubblegum's precision or Marceline's dry restraint, the entire emotional architecture of the series would shift. His looseness is not incidental. It is part of the show's understanding that wisdom does not always sound formal, and that some of the deepest things a person can say arrive disguised as ordinary conversation. Marceline's floating, present from her earliest appearances, is drawn with a specific, consistent, subtle bob, a small vertical drift that never fully stops even when she's otherwise standing still in a scene, a quiet, constant reminder that she's not actually touching the ground the way everyone else around her is. The movement is so gentle that many viewers probably register it only as a feeling rather than a specific animation choice. Marceline is rarely completely still. She hangs in the air with the effortless instability of something that belongs to a different set of physical rules than the people around her. That floating does more than identify her as supernatural. It gives her scenes a different emotional gravity. Conversations with Marceline often feel slightly detached from ordinary life because she is literally detached from the ground. She occupies space differently. She approaches other characters from angles that humans usually cannot. Even moments of intimacy carry a faint sense of otherness. There's something unexpectedly lonely about that animation choice too. The constant floating means Marceline is almost never fully sharing the same physical experience as everyone else. She is close to people, often emotionally closer than she admits, but her body remains separated by a few inches of air. The show never draws attention to that as symbolism, yet it quietly reinforces her position as someone who has lived for centuries, outlasted entire civilizations, and learned how to remain near people without entirely belonging to their world. When she does choose to land, when her feet actually touch the ground, those moments acquire a subtle weight precisely because the show has trained us to think of her as slightly airborne. The absence of floating becomes a form of presence. The show's handling of seasons and weather across Ooo is genuinely inconsistent in small waves from episode to episode, and rather than being corrected, that inconsistency simply became part of the world's overall texture, a place where climate and season don't always behave predictably, which fits neatly with everything else we know about how thoroughly this post-war world's rules were rewritten by the catastrophe that created it. At first glance, it looks like ordinary cartoon continuity. One episode is snowy, another is summery, another feels like autumn, and the transitions are not always explained. But over time, that inconsistency begins to feel strangely appropriate. Ooo is not Earth anymore. It is a landscape shaped by magic, mutation, ancient technology, and ecological processes that may have been altered beyond recognition. Different kingdoms maintain their own climates almost independently. Weather can become local rather than regional. A journey of a few hours can move characters between environments that feel as though they belong to entirely different planets. The result is a world that behaves more like memory than meteorology. Places are defined by emotional and narrative atmosphere as much as by geographic logic. The Ice Kingdom is always winter because the Ice King is winter. The Fire Kingdom is always heat because Flame Princess is heat. Ooo becomes a landscape where character and environment continually reshape one another.
That flexibility also gives the show unusual visual freedom. It can place Finn and Jake in snow, rain, autumn forests, deserts, and lush spring fields without needing elaborate transitional episodes every time. The world remains coherent not because it obeys realistic climate systems, but because it obeys emotional and thematic consistency. Let's slow all the way down now, because we're getting deep enough into the night that it's worth spending real time on a few final, quieter details before we close things out. There's something worth appreciating in just how much of this show's density comes from things that were never going to be noticed by the vast majority of its audience, at least not during a normal single watch. Most of what we've covered tonight requires deliberate rewatching, pausing, comparing screenshots across seasons separated by years. That's a strange thing to build into a show when you think about it honestly. Most of the effort behind these details was never going to be seen by most people who watched the show at all. And yet the effort went in anyway, consistently, season after season, because the people making it clearly cared about the world holding together, Even in the corners, nobody was likely to examine closely. The longer I spend with this series, the more I think that hidden effort is part of what people are actually responding to, even when they can't identify it directly. You don't need to notice a recurring background prop to feel that a world has history. You don't need to recognize a reused musical motif to feel that a character has emotional continuity. The details operate below the level of conscious analysis, creating an atmosphere of reliability. A world built from hundreds of consistent small choices feels different from a world built from hundreds of disconnected clever ideas. Adventure Time is full of clever ideas, but what gives it unusual longevity is that the cleverness is anchored to continuity. The strange creature that appears once may appear again. The joke object may become emotionally important later. The background location may still exist years from now. The show behaves as though memory is part of the environment. I think that's worth sitting with as its own kind of quiet lesson, separate from any specific detail we've actually covered tonight. There's something worth admiring in doing careful, thorough work in places where almost nobody will ever notice or reward you for it. This show did that constantly, across 10 years, embedding consistency and care into background shots, minor character designs, single-use extras, color grading choices that mostly registered subconsciously if they registered at all. Nobody was going to fail to enjoy the show if any single one of these details had been skipped. The show would have worked fine without most of what we spent tonight excavating. It simply chose not to skip any of it anyway. That kind of invisible craftsmanship has a peculiar emotional effect. It creates trust. The audience begins trusting that the show remembers itself, and once that trust exists, later revelations become more powerful because viewers believe the writers have been paying attention all along. Foreshadowing works better in a world that feels consistently maintained. Emotional callbacks land harder when objects and locations actually persist across time. It also changes the experience of rewatching. Many shows become smaller on a second viewing because the surprises are gone. Adventure Time often becomes larger. Once the plot no longer demands all of your attention, the background begins speaking. You start noticing architecture, weather, props, music, color, gestures, and tiny continuity choices that were always present but previously hidden beneath the urgency of finding out what happened next. The show rewards the disappearance of urgency. That may be one of the reasons it works so well as something to fall asleep to. A story built on constant surprise tends to resist drifting attention. This one, despite containing enormous mysteries and dramatic revelations, is strangely comfortable with partial attention. You can miss a minute and return without feeling lost. You can let a paragraph wash over you without extracting every fact from it. The world remains intact. That generosity toward the audience feels increasingly rare. The whole shape of tonight really is not one big argument, the way some of our other deep dives have built toward. Just a long accumulation of small, careful choices, each one easy to miss individually, adding up, across 10 seasons, into a world that rewards exactly the kind of patient, close attention we've spent this whole video giving it. There's a temptation when talking about a show this beloved to look only for the biggest meanings, the grand mythology, the cosmic entities, the philosophical speeches, the revelations about Simon, Betty, the Lich, or the Mushroom War. Those things matter enormously. But worlds are rarely held together by their biggest moments. They are held together by recurring windows, by familiar sounds, by the way a character always stands in the same doorway, by the object that remains on a shelf for 5 seasons without anyone mentioning it. They are held together by the ordinary. Adventure Time understands that instinctively. It spends an astonishing amount of energy on ordinary continuity inside an extraordinary setting. And because of that, Ooo eventually begins to feel less like a fantasy realm and more like a place that could continue existing after we stop looking at it, which is perhaps the highest compliment any fictional world can receive.
There's more worth adding here before we let tonight rest completely, because 10 seasons of a show this dense leaves an enormous amount of material still worth walking through slowly. The Fire Kingdom's throne room, glimpsed across several non-consecutive episodes, maintains a consistent internal layout even as the specific characters occupying it change across the show's run. The positioning of the throne itself, the placement of the entrance, the general proportions of the space all hold steady,
which means the room reads as a genuinely consistent physical location rather than a loosely redrawn backdrop reassembled fresh each time the story needs it. That may sound like a tiny production detail, but it quietly changes how power feels in the series. A throne room that remains physically stable across years of storytelling suggests that institutions outlast rulers. Characters may change, relationships may shift, and kingdoms may experience upheaval, but the room itself remembers previous occupants. The audience begins building a mental map. You know where the throne is before the camera reveals it. You understand how characters move through the space. Confrontations feel grounded because everyone is standing inside a place that has existed before and will likely exist afterward. This is one of the subtle differences between a set and a location. A set exists for a scene. A location exists for a history. The Fire Kingdom repeatedly feels like a location, and that feeling comes from dozens of continuity decisions just like this one, each individually small, collectively enormous. Peppermint Butler's summoning rituals, shown in a handful of scattered episodes, use consistent visual symbols across every appearance. The same basic circular shape, the same general arrangement of candles, small details that recur precisely enough to suggest a genuinely thought-out internal magic system sitting behind the show's more casual, comedic treatment of his occult hobby. The remarkable thing is that the show almost never pauses to explain any of it. Peppermint Butler is allowed to be deeply knowledgeable about dark magic without becoming the protagonist of a fantasy epic. The rituals are usually glimpsed in passing, half hidden behind jokes or ordinary palace business, which makes them feel strangely more authentic. They resemble private practices that were already in progress before the camera arrived. If you compare the different ritual scenes across multiple seasons, the repetition becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The candles occupy familiar positions. The circles retain recognizable proportions. Certain symbols return with enough consistency that they begin to feel like a real magical vocabulary rather than decorative, spooky imagery. The audience is not given a dictionary for that vocabulary, but the show behaves as though one exists somewhere off-screen. That attitude toward magic is one of the series' most interesting habits. Rather than presenting magic as a set of clearly explained rules, it often presents it as a culture. People who practice it seem to know things they do not bother explaining. Rituals have traditions. Objects have histories. Certain gestures are performed because they have always been performed. The result is that magic feels inherited rather than invented. Peppermint Butler becomes especially unsettling because he treats all of this with complete normality. He is polite while summoning dangerous forces. He remains impeccably mannered while participating in ceremonies that would feel apocalyptic in almost any other show. The contrast between his calm demeanor and the seriousness of the magic surrounding him creates a kind of quiet horror that Adventure Time is unusually good at sustaining, without ever abandoning its overall gentle tone. The grasslands themselves, the general default terrain most episodes take place in, include specific rock formations that recur across unrelated episodes filmed and aired years apart. A particular jagged outcropping glimpsed once in an early season reappears, recognizably the same shape, in a background shot from several seasons later, suggesting a genuinely consistent internal geography being maintained behind the scenes rather than freshly invented backgrounds generated without reference to what came before. This is one of those details that almost nobody notices consciously, yet it contributes enormously to the feeling that Finn and Jake are actually traveling through the same world repeatedly. Many animated adventure shows treat landscapes as interchangeable. Forests are forests, hills are hills, mountains are mountains. Adventure Time quietly resists that impulse. The rocks become landmarks. A strangely shaped cliff appears in one episode, and then seasons later appears from a different angle during an entirely different story. A familiar hill sits on the horizon while characters discuss something unrelated. The geography begins to acquire memory. What I love about this is that it mirrors the way real places become familiar. You rarely memorize a map all at once. You gradually accumulate landmarks. The unusual tree near the river, the bend in the road, the building with the cracked wall. Ooo reveals itself through repeated encounters rather than formal cartography. That repeated geography also changes the emotional texture of travel. When Finn and Jake leave the tree fort, they're not entering a generic wilderness. They are moving through a landscape that has already witnessed previous adventures. The world remembers where they have been, and the audience, if only subconsciously, begins remembering with it. Root Beer Guy, a background candy citizen who appears with unusually frequent feces compared to most of Bubblegum's other unnamed subjects, shows up in enough scattered scenes across enough different seasons that longtime viewers have specifically tracked his recurring presence as its own small, ongoing observation. He's never given a major storyline. He's simply there, consistently, more often than most similarly minor characters, which has made him something of a quiet fan favorite purely through sheer repeated visibility. There's something strangely realistic about that kind of recurrence. In a real town, you often recognize people whose names you do not know, the person who always seems to be at the market, the neighbor you pass while walking home, the face that gradually becomes familiar through repetition rather than intimacy.
Root Beer Guy functions exactly like that. He is not important because the plot tells us he is important. He becomes important because the world keeps quietly insisting that he exists. Every new appearance reinforces the illusion that life in the Candy Kingdom continues between episodes, that citizens have routines, jobs, conversations, and ordinary afternoons that are never dramatic enough to become stories. This is a surprisingly powerful form of world building because it does not rely on explanation. The show does not tell us that the Candy Kingdom is a functioning society. It shows us a citizen who keeps showing up. Repetition creates reality. By the time later episodes give Root Beer Guy more explicit attention, the audience already feels as though they know him, not because they know his biography, but because they have shared time with him. That is a very different kind of character attachment from the one produced by dramatic backstory, and it is one of the series' quietest strengths. The specific shade of green used for Slime Princess and her kingdom is subtly different from the green used elsewhere in the show for unrelated purposes, distinct enough that a careful colorist clearly made a deliberate choice to keep her visual identity separate from any other green-associated element in Oo's broader color language. This may seem almost absurdly specific, but color consistency is one of the invisible systems holding the entire show together. Ooo contains an enormous number of fantastical environments, and one of the ways the series prevents them from blending into visual noise is by assigning each region its own emotional temperature through color. Slime green is not forest green. It carries moisture, viscosity, softness, and a slightly alien quality that ordinary vegetation does not. The kingdom feels organic in a different way from the grasslands. It is less about growth and more about transformation, about substances changing shape and remaining fluid. That distinction becomes important whenever characters move rapidly between locations. The audience can identify a kingdom almost instantly through color, before architecture or dialogue provides confirmation. The show has trained us to read hue as geography. It also reinforces character identity. Slime Princess does not merely rule a green kingdom, she visually belongs to it in a way that feels almost ecological. The environment and the ruler appear generated by the same underlying material, which is true of many kingdoms in Ooo and contributes to the sense that these places are expressions of the beings who inhabit them. Marceline's cave, home to her in the show's present-day timeline, contains background photographs and drawings that recur across multiple episodes, several of which become directly relevant to storylines only explored properly much later in the series. A photo booth strip glimpsed briefly in the background of one episode ties directly to her history with Princess Bubblegum, confirmed explicitly only in a considerably later storyline. This is one of my favorite examples of how the show hides emotional information in domestic space. Marceline's cave is cluttered. Instruments, furniture, old objects, drawings, and photographs are scattered everywhere, and the clutter initially reads as personality. She is artistic, she is ancient, she has accumulated things. The cave feels lived in. Then gradually, individual objects begin acquiring narrative weight.
A photograph that once seemed decorative becomes evidence. A drawing becomes memory. A piece of clothing becomes a relic of a relationship the audience did not yet know existed. The cave transforms from a cool vampire apartment to an archive of emotional history. What makes this especially effective is that the objects are usually visible before they become meaningful. The audience has already seen them. The show is not introducing a new photograph when it wants to reveal Marceline and Bubblegum's past. It is revealing the meaning of a photograph that has been quietly present for a long time. That is a fundamentally different storytelling experience from a traditional flashback. Instead of receiving information, we discover that information has been sitting in the room with us all along. The specific design of Prismo's time room uses a flat, two-dimensional visual style distinct from the show's usual three-dimensional character designs, a deliberate choice that reinforces his own nature as fundamentally different from every other being Finn and Jake encounter, existing as a kind of dream rather than a conventional physical presence. The room feels less like architecture than an illustration someone accidentally walked into. Lines are cleaner, depth is stranger. The usual physical rules governing space seem slightly relaxed. Characters appear to occupy a place that is simultaneously a room, a screen, and the thought. That visual departure matters because Prismo is one of the few characters in the series who genuinely feels outside ordinary reality. Many magical beings in Ooo are powerful, but they still seem to inhabit the world. Prismo inhabits a layer adjacent to the world. The flatness suggests that we are looking at reality from the side. It also creates a fascinating contrast with the show's otherwise very tactile environments. Most of Ooo feels textured. Wood looks carved, grass looks soft, ice looks sharp. Prismo space feels conceptual. It is almost made of ideas rather than materials. Because the show changes visual language instead of relying solely on exposition, the audience understands Prismo's difference immediately. We are not merely told that he is cosmic. We are placed inside a visual system that behaves differently from everything else we have seen before.
Hudson Abadidir's business suit, worn consistently across every appearance, includes small details, a particular tie pattern, a specific cut of jacket, that remain unchanged across every single episode he appears in, spanning many different seasons, suggesting a genuinely fixed character model maintained carefully, rather than loosely redrawn fresh each time. The suit is funny at first because of the contrast. A demonic ruler from the Nightosphere wearing formal business attire is already a strong visual joke. But the longer the series goes on, the more the consistency of that attire becomes interesting. Hudson dresses like someone who has been dressing the same way for a long time. There is almost no experimentation, no costume changes reflecting mood or status. The suit becomes part of his identity in the same way Marceline's base or Bubblegum's crown becomes part of theirs. That permanence gives him a strangely timeless quality. He appears as though he has arrived from an office that exists outside history, carrying bureaucratic confidence into supernatural space. The comedy gradually turns into characterization. Hudson feels like a being who values order, contracts, and personal presentation even while ruling a realm of demons. The Citadel, the cosmic prison glimpsed in several episodes, uses an architectural style distinct from everywhere else in the show, angular and imposing in a way that visually separates it from Oo's more organic, rounded default aesthetic, signaling before any dialogue confirms it that this location operates under entirely different rules than the rest of the show's world. The Citadel does not feel inhabited in the ordinary sense. It feels administered. Walls rise with mathematical precision. Corridors seem designed for function rather than comfort. The scale is deliberately difficult to comprehend, making characters appear small in a way that very few locations in the series attempt. That scale matters, because the Citadel is one of the places where Adventure Time briefly stops feeling local. Most adventures in Ooo, no matter how strange, retain some sense of neighborhood. Kingdoms are places people live. Forests are places people wander.
Even magical realms often feel personal. The Citadel feels institutional on a cosmic level. It suggests that the universe contains structures of authority far beyond the kingdoms Finn and Jake know, systems that existed before their adventures and will likely continue after them. The architecture communicates that frightening impersonality before a single cosmic law is explained. And that is another pattern quietly running underneath everything we have been discussing tonight. Whenever the show wants to introduce a fundamentally different layer of reality, it changes the language of the world itself. Not just the dialogue, not just the plot. The colors, the shapes, the textures, the movement, the way space is drawn. Ooo is a world where visual style is never merely decoration. It is part of the storytelling machinery, quietly carrying information across years of episodes, waiting patiently for the moment when someone finally slows down enough to notice it. Take the Enchiridion again for a moment, because the more time you spend looking at it, the stranger it becomes as an object. Most fantasy stories treat ancient books as symbols first and physical objects second. They glow when the plot needs them to glow, reveal secrets when the hero is ready to, and otherwise exist in a kind of timeless perfection that keeps them from ever feeling as though they were actually carried through the world by real people. The Enchiridion doesn't quite work that way. It feels handled. It feels worn. The scratches on the cover remain in the same places across appearances separated by years of production. The edges stay softened in recognizable ways, and the whole thing carries the quiet visual suggestion that someone has been opening it, closing it, dropping it, stuffing it into bags, and generally living with it for a long time. That consistency changes the emotional weight of the object almost without the audience realizing it, because the book begins to feel less like a magical reward and more like a companion. Something that has survived alongside its owners, rather than simply being possessed by them. When Finn carries it, he isn't holding a pristine artifact preserved outside history. He's holding something that already has history embedded into its surface, and that makes his own place in the chain of heroes feel unexpectedly tangible, as though the marks on the cover are evidence of previous lives brushing up against his own. The same quiet accumulation of history is happening inside BMO, which is an odd sentence to say about a small game console with a smiling screen, but it becomes increasingly true the longer the series goes on. BMO's display changes constantly, not just in obvious emotional expressions, but in tiny interface details, recurring game screens, familiar loading animations, and little technological habits that return across episodes separated by long stretches of time. What's remarkable is that the show never treats these as continuity flexes or hidden puzzles. It simply allows BMO to have an internal digital life that continues whether the audience is paying attention or not. You begin to get the sense that BMO has games BMO has been playing for years, songs BMO has been practicing off-screen, imaginary conversations BMO has been continuing in private. And the tiny screen is less a face than a window into a consciousness that is constantly busy with things unrelated to the current adventure. That is a surprisingly generous way to write a side character, because it grants BMO the dignity of having experiences that do not exist solely in service of Finn and Jake's story. And the recurring interfaces become small pieces of evidence that BMO remembers, experiments, and changes in ways that are mostly invisible unless you happen to be looking very closely. The Ice King's crown goes through its own quiet process of clarification across the run of the series, and the fascinating thing is that the visual evolution of the object accidentally mirrors the narrative evolution of the character wearing it. Early versions of the crown are a little looser, a little less specific, the points slightly different, the jewel arrangement not yet completely settled, but over time the design stabilizes until it becomes immediately recognizable in any era of the show's timeline. That gradual stabilization matters because the story itself becomes increasingly interested in the crown not as a generic magical object, but as a specific artifact with a specific history attached to Simon Petrikov, Betty, and centuries of accumulated tragedy. But the time later seasons are moving freely between different periods of history, the crown has acquired enough visual identity that it can function almost like a recurring character in its own right. You recognize it instantly, whether it is sitting on Simon's head in the distant past or on the Ice King's head in the present, and the object begins carrying emotional continuity across time, in the same way Marceline's base or Finn's swords do. It is no longer just the thing that causes magic. It is the thing that has been silently watching generations of people lose themselves. And the fact that the animators consistently draw it as something heavy, something that changes posture and seems to press downward on whoever wears it, makes the eventual understanding of Simon's suffering feel as though it has been present in the visuals long before the script ever fully explained it. Princess Bubblegum's age is another example of the show refusing a kind of precision that would actually make the world feel smaller. We are given enough information to understand that she has existed for centuries, enough flashbacks to know that she has watched kingdoms rise and fall, enough evidence to realize that she remembers versions of Ooo that no longer exist. But the series almost never stops to provide a definitive number, and I think that restraint is quietly brilliant because it keeps longevity emotional rather than mathematical. Bubblegum feels old not because we can calculate her exact age, but because she behaves like someone carrying an enormous archive of memory. She plans on timescales that other characters rarely consider. She approaches problems with the confidence of someone who has already seen dozens of similar problems before, and she occasionally reveals flashes of exhaustion that make no sense unless you imagine hundreds of years of responsibility compressed into a single consciousness. The ambiguity allows the audience to focus on what immortality feels like, rather than how long it lasts, and that turns her into a much more complicated character than a simple, ageless genius. She is brilliant, yes, but she is also burdened by continuity itself, by the fact that she remembers things other people have forgotten, and the show wisely leaves enough space around that burden for the audience to imagine it, rather than reducing it to a number on a timeline. One of the details I keep coming back to is the way pre-war human technology appears throughout Ooo not as sacred relics, but as ordinary materials that have been absorbed into everyday life. A rusted vehicle becomes part of a building, a broken machine becomes furniture, a fragment of infrastructure becomes a landmark that nobody questions anymore, and the series almost never pauses to identify these objects as remnants of a lost civilization because, from the perspective of most characters, they aren't remnants at all. They are simply the world. That choice creates an extraordinary kind of archaeological depth because the audience is often in the strange position of recognizing pieces of its own civilization inside a future that no longer understands them. We know what a highway used to be. We know what a tank was designed for. We know that certain twisted metal shapes were once part of cities full of ordinary people, and the characters move past those objects with the casual familiarity of people who inherited ruins the way other societies inherit mountains. The result is that the background is constantly telling a second story, a story about how civilizations disappear not only through destruction, but through reinterpretation, how objects survive by becoming something else, and how history gradually transforms from memory into environment, until nobody remembers that the environment was once built by human hands. Finn's collection of swords completes that thought in a strangely intimate way, because those weapons are essentially his own archaeological lair. Earlier swords do not simply vanish when a new one arrives. They remain mounted on walls, stored in corners of the treehouse, visible in the background of later episodes like fossils of previous versions of the hero. Each sword corresponds to a different period of his life, a different understanding of courage, a different relationship with the world. And by allowing those objects to remain physically present, the show refuses the idea that growing older means replacing who you used to be. Instead, it suggests that identity is cumulative. The child who first picked up a sword still exists inside the teenager learning harder lessons about responsibility and loss, and the treehouse becomes a museum of that accumulation, a place where earlier adventures continue existing quietly while entirely different stories unfold in the foreground. There is something unexpectedly moving about a weapon hanging silently on a wall after it has ceased to be useful, because it implies that usefulness is not the only reason to keep something. Memory is also a reason. Gratitude is a reason. The desire to remember who you were when you carried that object is a reason. And Adventure Time is full of characters who continue carrying old versions of themselves long after the world has asked them to become someone new. The specific cadence of Jake's speech patterns becomes even more interesting once you start comparing it across different emotional contexts, because what initially sounds like casual improvisation gradually reveals itself as a remarkably disciplined performance. Jake almost never rushes toward the important part of what he is trying to say. He circles it. He approaches it from the side. He tells a story that seems unrelated, gets distracted by a memory, comments on something happening in the room, and then, almost without announcing that he has arrived, quietly lands on the exact emotional truth the other character needed to hear. That conversational rhythm gives him a kind of wisdom that feels discovered rather than performed. He rarely sounds like someone delivering advice. He sounds like someone remembering something out loud, and that makes the advice much easier to trust. Across 10 seasons, while Finn's voice matures and his emotional vocabulary expands dramatically, Jake remains anchored by the same loose, spacious way of speaking, and the consistency becomes part of the emotional architecture of the show itself. When Jake starts talking, the series often becomes slightly less anxious. The pace slows down. The world feels a little less interested in winning and a little more interested in understanding. That is an astonishing thing for a vocal performance to accomplish over such a long period of time, and it is one of the reasons Jake remains so comforting even in episodes where he is frightened, uncertain, or grieving. His sentences always seem to leave room for tomorrow. Marceline's floating works in a surprisingly similar way. It is such a small animation choice that most viewers absorb it without ever consciously identifying it. Yet it changes the emotional geometry of almost every scene she appears in. She is rarely fully planted on the ground. There's always that gentle vertical drift, that quiet suspension in the air that makes her movements feel less like walking and more like gliding through a world she has already crossed 1,000 times before. The floating gives her an effortless quality that could easily have made her seem emotionally distant, but the show uses it in the opposite direction. Because she moves so quietly, because she occupies space with so little apparent effort, moments when she becomes emotionally heavy suddenly feel much larger. A character who is always floating can appear startlingly vulnerable simply by becoming still. The animation creates a subtle contrast between physical lightness and emotional weight, and Marceline spends much of the series living inside that contrast. She jokes constantly, sings casually, teases Finn and Jake, acts as though centuries of existence have become ordinary, and then a single quiet moment reveals how much loneliness has been suspended inside that effortless posture the entire time. The floating becomes a visual metaphor the show never has to explain. She is always slightly above the ground, always slightly separated from ordinary human experience, always close enough to touch, and yet never quite sharing the same physical reality as the people around her. The weather across Ooo is another one of those details that initially looks like inconsistency and gradually starts feeling like world building. Seasons do not behave the way they are supposed to. Snow appears and disappears without the kind of transitional logic a realistic climate would require. Entire kingdoms maintain weather systems that seem almost independent from the surrounding landscape, and the show rarely bothers to justify any of it. But the more you think about the Mushroom War, about magic, about mutated ecosystems and a reality that has been repeatedly reshaped by forces ordinary science cannot fully account for, the more appropriate that instability becomes. Ooo is not simply a fantasy version of Earth. It is a world that has survived an event severe enough to rewrite the relationship between nature and civilization. The climates feel emotionally specific rather than meteorologically precise. The Ice Kingdom is winter because Simon's grief has become architecture. The Fire Kingdom is heat because its ruler is literally made of flame. Forests feel ancient or welcoming or unsettling depending on what kind of story is being told there, and the series trusts that emotional coherence more than geographic accuracy. That trust is one of the reasons the world remains so dreamlike without ever becoming incomprehensible. Dreams often have perfectly consistent emotional logic while ignoring ordinary physical rules, and Ooo frequently behaves exactly that way. You always understand how a place feels, even if you could never predict what season it's supposed to be. There's something worth noticing too about how often the show returns to nighttime, not simply as a time of day, but as a state of mind. A remarkable number of episodes end under the stars, with the tree fort silhouetted against a dark sky, and the repetition gradually turns that image into a kind of emotional home. No matter how strange the adventure has been, how cosmic the stakes became, or how much a character changed during the episode, the night sky seems to absorb the experience and return the world to a quieter rhythm. The stars over Ooo are unusually important because they are one of the few things that remain emotionally stable across the entire series. Kingdoms change rulers, magic systems become more complicated. Characters discover hidden histories and alternate realities and ancient responsibilities, but the night keeps arriving. The tree fort keeps standing beneath it. That repeated visual ending creates the feeling that adventures are temporary and existence is continuous. Tomorrow will happen, another morning will come, another strange creature will wander through the forest, another conversation will begin on the porch. The series repeatedly returns the audience to that sense of ongoing life, and it is difficult to overstate how comforting that becomes over the course of 10 seasons. The night sky is not simply a beautiful image, it is the show's quiet promise that the world continues even when the story pauses.
What keeps surprising me is how many of these details are connected by the same underlying idea. The worn and Kindridian, BMO's recurring interface screens, the crown becoming more visually specific, Bubblegum's ambiguous centuries-old human technology repurposed into everyday life, Finn's retired swords, Jake's patient speech, Marceline's constant floating, the unstable weather, the recurring night sky. None of them are major plot points, and yet all of them are doing the same kind of work. They are convincing us that time has actually passed. Not narrative time, the abstract sense that episodes occur in sequence, but lived time, the kind that leaves scratches on objects, habits and voices, memories and buildings and emotional weather inside landscapes. Most animated shows preserve characters by protecting them from time. Adventure Time preserves characters by allowing time to become visible everywhere around them. The world remembers, the people remember, even the background seems to remember. And because everything remembers, the audience begins remembering with it, until rewatching stops feeling like starting over and starts feeling like returning to a place that has been quietly waiting for you the whole time. There's something worth lingering on about the way Adventure Time treats ordinary objects once they have existed in the world long enough. Because one of the quiet miracles of the show is that almost anything can eventually acquire emotional gravity if the series simply keeps remembering it. A chair can become a memory, a shirt can become a relationship, a photograph can become an entire period of someone's life compressed into a single frame hanging quietly on a wall. The show almost never announces when an object has crossed that invisible threshold from prop to history. It simply allows the object to remain present, episode after episode, until familiarity itself becomes meaning. That is a very different approach from the kind of storytelling where important objects are highlighted with dramatic music and close-up shots the moment they enter the narrative. Here, importance is often retrospective. You realize something mattered only after you have already spent years seeing it in the background, and that creates the uncanny feeling that the world has been patiently storing emotional information while you are paying attention to something else. The tree fort is probably the clearest example of this, but it extends far beyond the fort itself. Marceline's cave slowly accumulates drawings, instruments, photographs, and scraps of old life that initially read as personality and later reveal themselves as biography. Bubblegum's laboratory fills with recurring pieces of equipment that suggest research projects continuing between episodes. Even seemingly insignificant decorations have a habit of surviving long enough that the audience begins to recognize them without consciously trying to. The effect is cumulative rather than dramatic. Ooo starts feeling inhabited by people who keep things, who move things from one room to another, who forget objects in corners, who leave reminders of previous relationships sitting on shelves because removing them would require admitting that time has passed. It is an astonishingly human way to build a fantasy world, because fantasy often focuses on the spectacular, while this show repeatedly invests energy in the domestic, and the domestic is what makes the spectacular believable. One of the details that becomes strangely moving once you start noticing it is how often characters are surrounded by evidence of lives that extend beyond the current episode. Finn and Jake are almost never in empty rooms. Marceline is almost never in a space that does not contain traces of previous songs, previous conversations, previous centuries.
Bubblegum's environments are full of ongoing experiments, unfinished ideas, and technologies whose purposes are never explained because they are not currently relevant. The world feels as though it contains unfinished business everywhere. Not unresolved plot threads in the television sense, but ordinary incompletion, the kind that exists in any real home where someone is in the middle of reading a book, repairing a machine, writing a letter, or learning a song. That ordinary incompletion is one of the strongest illusions of reality the series ever creates, because real life is rarely organized into neatly completed episodes. Most lives are collections of projects, memories, and objects that continue existing while other things happen. This is also why the show's approach to continuity feels different from simple fan service. Many long-running series include callbacks designed primarily to reward attentive viewers, and Adventure Time certainly does that sometimes, but its deeper continuity is less about rewarding recognition than about preserving existence. A recurring object does not always return because the audience will clap when it appears. It returns because the show behaves as though it never stopped existing in the first place. That distinction is subtle but important. The audience is not being congratulated for remembering. The audience is being invited into a world that remembers itself. The emotional effect is completely different. Instead of feeling clever, you feel at home. The longer the series goes on, the more Ooo begins to resemble a place built from sediment rather than invention. Every season deposits another thin layer of history. A friendship changes shape. A kingdom acquires a new ruler. A magical object reveals another piece of its past. A background character appears often enough to become familiar. None of these layers erases the ones beneath it. They accumulate. The world becomes thicker. You can almost imagine digging downward through earlier seasons the way an archaeologist digs through earlier civilizations, each layer still present beneath the earlier ones, each one explaining something about the layer above it. That geological feeling is unusual in animation because animation is often associated with repetition and reset. But Adventure Time repeatedly chooses accumulation over reset, and the result is that watching later seasons can feel like walking through a city built on top of older cities that have never completely disappeared. The show's relationship with memory is probably the deepest thread connecting all of these observations, because memory in Adventure Time is rarely treated as a simple flashback device. It is treated as a physical force. Simon carries memory in the crown. Marceline carries it in songs. Bubblegum carries it in laboratories and political decisions. Finn carries it in scars and retired swords. Even places carry memory, absorbing previous occupants and previous versions of themselves, until architecture becomes biography. When the series finally reveals large pieces of its hidden history, those revelations work not because the writer suddenly invented a tragic past, but because the world has been behaving like a place that possesses memory from the very beginning. The audience has already learned the grammar of remembering long before the show begins speaking in complete historical sentences. I keep thinking about the opening title sequence while talking about all of this, because the title sequence is doing exactly the same thing on a larger scale. The rusted vehicles and half-buried ruins are not simply foreshadowing the Mushroom War. They are teaching the audience how to watch the show. They are saying that bright things may be growing on top of old things, that cheerful surfaces may contain forgotten histories, that the background is worth looking at because the background is where time has been stored. Once you learn that lesson, the entire series opens up differently. The tree fort becomes a historical site. Marceline's cave becomes an archive. Bubblegum's lab becomes a chronicle of scientific obsession. The grasslands become an archaeological field stretching across centuries of invisible events. The title sequence is not merely introducing a world, it is introducing a method of attention. That method of attention changes the emotional experience of rewatching in a way I find surprisingly difficult to describe. Most rewatches are about knowing what happens next. This rewatch is about noticing what was already there. The suspense is replaced by recognition. You begin seeing the show almost the way the characters see Ooo, as a place full of familiar landmarks whose meanings continue deepening over time. A rock formation is not just a rock formation because you remember passing it before. A melody is not just a melody because it carries another scene inside it. A room is not just a room because you remember who used to live there. The series gradually teaches the audience to inhabit memory the way its oldest characters inhabit memory. And that may be one of the reasons the later seasons feel emotionally larger than the earlier ones, even when the stories themselves remain relatively small. The world has accumulated enough remembered life that almost any scene can resonate with previous scenes simultaneously. There's also something quietly radical about how little the show insists that you notice any of this. It does not punish partial attention. It does not require encyclopedic knowledge to function. A child can watch Adventure Time as a sequence of funny adventures and have a wonderful experience. An adult can watch it years later and discover an entirely different series hidden inside the same episodes. The show is layered rather than gated. The deeper material is available, but it is not mandatory. That generosity is part of what makes it such an unusually enduring work of animation. It grows with the viewer because it was built with enough structural depth that different kinds of attention reveal different kinds of meaning. And maybe that is the feeling we have been circling all night without quite naming directly. The feeling that Ooo is not trying to impress you. It is trying to outlast you. It behaves like a place that existed before you arrived and will continue existing after you leave. And the details we keep noticing are simply the evidence of that confidence. The scratches on the Enchiridion, the recurring interfaces on BMO's screen, the stabilized design of the crown, the old technology embedded in the landscape, the swords hanging quietly on the wall, the familiar cadence of Jake's voice, the slight drift of Marceline's floating, the weather that obeys emotional rather than meteorological logic, the night sky returning again and again over the tree fort. All of them are small acts of persistence. The show keeps saying the same thing in different forms. This world remembers, and because it remembers, it feels alive. The longer I spend looking at the background of Adventure Time, the more I think the show is quietly built around the idea that history is not something that happened, it is something that remains. Most fantasy worlds present history as information. A kingdom was founded, a war occurred, a magical artifact was created, and characters occasionally explain those facts when the plot requires them. Ooo behaves differently. History is sediment. It settles into architecture, into weather, into songs, into objects left on shelves, and scratches left on books, and ruins left half-buried beneath grass that has centuries to forget what it is growing on top of. The world is not surrounded by its past, it is made out of its past. And that is why so many of the smallest details feel unexpectedly important once you begin paying attention to them. They are not decorations added to a finished setting. They are the visible edges of older layers pressing upward through the present. Think about how often the show allows a location to exist before it explains why that location matters. Marceline's cave appears long before the audience understands the depth of the life that has been lived inside it. The tree fort feels like home long before we learn that it was someone else's home first. The grasslands seem simply beautiful until the opening title sequence quietly reminds us that beauty has been growing over wreckage this entire time. Even the kingdoms themselves are rarely introduced through formal exposition. Finn and Jake wander into them. We learn them the way travelers learn places in real life, through repeated visits, through landmarks, through the accumulation of ordinary experiences rather than through a narrator unfolding a map. That wandering quality gives Ooo an unusual sense of discovery because the world is never presented as fully knowable. There is always another valley, another ruin, another kingdom, another strange person who seems to have been living a complete life before the episode began. This is probably why the background characters become so emotionally effective, despite receiving comparatively little screen time. Root Beer Guy appears often enough that he stops feeling like a joke and starts feeling like a neighbor. The Candy Citizens developed a vague familiarity of people you pass on the same street every morning. The snail becomes almost absurdly comforting simply because it keeps existing. None of these characters need elaborate backstories for the illusion to work. The repetition itself is the backstory. Familiarity is one of the oldest forms of affection, and Adventure Time understands that perhaps better than almost any animated series of its era. It does not always ask the audience to love characters because of dramatic revelations. Sometimes it simply asks the audience to keep seeing them until love arrives quietly on its own. There is a similar patience in the show's relationship with music. We talked earlier about Marceline's recurring motifs, but the more you listen across the full run of the series, the more the soundtrack begins to resemble a memory system rather than a collection of cues. Certain emotional textures return in slightly altered forms. Instruments associated with particular characters appear in scenes where those characters are absent but emotionally present. Melodies seem to remember previous episodes even when the dialogue does not explicitly reference them. The music is rarely trying to overwhelm a moment. It is trying to haunt it gently, to leave a trace of another time underneath the current one. That is why so many scenes continue echoing long after they end. They are carrying musical ghosts. The same thing happens visually with light. Nighttime in Ooo is never just darkness. It is a different emotional register. The sky above the tree fort has a softness that the daytime world rarely possesses, and the repeated return to that image across so many episodes gradually transforms it into a kind of emotional anchor. No matter how chaotic the story has become, the night has a way of absorbing the day without erasing it. The adventurers settle into the darkness the way memories settle into sleep, and the audience is invited to feel that settling rather than simply observe it. I think that is one of the reasons these endings work so well for a video like this. The show itself keeps practicing the same movement we are practicing tonight, from excitement into stillness, from discovery into reflection, from movement into rest. What continues to surprise me is how often the series chooses restraint when spectacle would have been easier. The Citadel could have been redesigned every time it appeared in order to look even more impressive. Instead, it remains recognizably itself, an institution rather than a special effect. The Nightosphere could have become increasingly elaborate with each visit. Instead, it keeps returning to the same oppressive palette and the same feeling of ancient heat. Bubblegum's laboratory could have been reinvented whenever a new invention was needed. Instead, the old equipment remains, suggesting ongoing work rather than isolated episodes of genius. This restraint is a form of confidence. The show trusts that consistency is more powerful than novelty, that a place becomes magical not only because it is strange, but because it remains itself long enough for us to build a relationship with it. That idea keeps leading back to memory, and I don't think that's an accident. Simon's tragedy is memory. Marceline's loneliness is memory. Bubblegum's burden is memory. Finn's scars are memory. Jake's wisdom is memory transformed into patience. Even the Mushroom War is remembered less through direct depiction than through the objects and landscapes it left behind. The series is full of characters trying to decide what to keep, what to forget, what to forgive, and what can never be repaired no matter how much time passes. In that context, the obsessive continuity of the background artist starts feeling less like production diligence and more like thematic participation. The world itself refuses to forget. The animators are remembering on behalf of the setting. There is something quietly beautiful about that collaboration between theme and craft. A story about the persistence of the past is being told by artists who keep drawing the same scratches on the same book, the same rock formations on the same horizon, the same photographs on the same cave wall. The philosophy of the show is literally being enacted by the people making it. Every recurring prop is an act of remembrance. Every consistent background is a refusal to erase. Every returning melody is a small promise that previous emotions still matter. The audience may never consciously notice most of these things, but the emotional effect remains. We feel the weight of remembered time even when we cannot identify the specific details carrying it. And maybe that's the feeling that has been growing gradually through this entire walk across Ooo. Not the excitement of uncovering secrets, although there are certainly secrets here, and not the satisfaction of solving puzzles, although the show rewards careful observation constantly, but the quieter feeling of realizing that a fictional world has been treating its own existence with an unusual tenderness. The creators kept remembering things because the world deserved to be remembered. They kept returning to the same places because those places had become real to them. They kept allowing objects, songs, buildings, and background characters to accumulate history because history was not an obstacle to storytelling. It was the atmosphere that made storytelling possible. That is a rare quality. It's easy to invent wonders. It's much harder to make wonders feel lived in. Ooo feels lived in because it is full of traces rather than explanations. The audience is constantly encountering evidence that someone was here before, that something happened earlier, that a relationship existed long enough to leave objects behind, that a civilization disappeared slowly enough for grass to grow over its machines. The show keeps whispering that every present moment is standing on top of other present moments that eventually became the past. And once you start hearing that whisper, it becomes almost impossible to stop hearing it. The world grows deeper every time you revisit it because the world has been carrying its own depth all along, waiting for the kind of attention that arrives only when there is nowhere else you need to be, and the night has become quiet enough that even the smallest details begin to sound like stories. That's where we'll leave things for tonight. A long, slow walk through the small stuff, the details easy to miss, the callbacks spread years apart, the quiet consistency running underneath a show that never really needed to work this hard in the corners nobody was watching closely and did anyway. If any of tonight's details were new to you, or if there's a specific corner of this show you'd want a future video to go looking even more closely through, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every one of these. Subscribe if you haven't yet.